Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's actually quite impressive to see that many people being interested in a simple topic like validate triggers. I mean, that's really awesome. Okay. So we're going to talk about validate triggers. As you can see from the slide already, we are quite drastic in our opinion, and we want to explain a little bit to you what constraints come with this and how we can get there to actually achieve that goal that we put on the slide. So let's first introduce ourselves. This is Christian. He started in BC development in 2019, actually with NAV still, and he provided many ideas to me about the lintercop rules, the very first starting of getting the idea into place and everything. In his daily work, he is mostly concerned with, or pretty much concerned with DevOps and pipelines building, and therefore also PowerShell stuff. He's probably far better by now with PowerShell than I am. And he really likes to ask these annoying kinds of questions. And he came to me and asked me, well, do you always validate? And I was like, well, you cannot always validate, of course, because there's like certain situations where you obviously cannot. So it depends. And he talked to me about this more and finally convinced me that it's a good idea to always validate. So that's why we're here today. If you want to reach out to him, you can either do that through GitHub or on the Discord BC Professionals. If you don't know about that, go check it out. It's a really cool place to be to discuss any kind of topics around Business Central.
Right, thank you. And with me is Stefan Maroń. You probably know him by now. He has a lot of stuff on GitHub, most prominently probably the code history and the recently added code history for sandboxes with nightly builds. We can check out changes on a daily basis. You can reach him on Twitter. He recently started doing live streams on YouTube, Twitter, and a bunch of other platforms. You probably want to catch that as well.
Okay. So let's look at the agenda first. We thought that maybe it would be a good idea to first get us all on the same page what we're going to talk about when we say validate trigger, like what is good validate code, and how you can structure that. Afterwards, we're going to look at a long, very long list of concerns. We ask around on Twitter in the community what you think about this topic, and we picked up as much as we could, as we can, and compiled that and gave you our opinion on all of those concerns, if you want to call them like that. And then, of course, afterwards, there are always at least some exceptions to the rule, so we're going to cover those as well. And at the very end, if we still have some time, we might do a longer Q&A, let's see. But if there is time left, we have some related topics that somehow are in the same scope, but not exactly cover, like not directly validate triggers. So what is the definition of validate itself? Like what does a validate do? What is it all about? So validate triggers, like if you call validate on a record variable, this does exactly two things. It checks, like validates the table relation if there is one, and if it isn't turned off, the validation. And it does call a bunch of code. That is 5 places in total. It's the validate trigger on the table itself. Then around that, you have the wrapper of the table extension with on before and on after validate. And then around that, you have the event subscribers. So that's actually like what you see on the slides. This is the order of execution, how those events get executed. It does not check basically everything else. Decimal places, min-max value, char allowed, and I think there are more properties that are that should be on the list. But we didn't find anything else that is actually validated with the validate. So
right.
Yeah.
This was a surprise to us as well.
Yes.
We were going through this list of decimal places, min-max values, chars allowed and all, and looked into what really gets checked when we call a validate, and it turns out really only the table relation and the validate code, or the validate triggers.
Okay. And those other properties seem to be only be valid for user interface validation. So when a user enters something on a page, then you get those checks as well, but from code, they're not executed. So now what is our idea of good validate code? Validate code itself should validate the data. Like you want to validate if the data that the user puts in or that somehow gets written into the field is valid. And then also, like, because we don't really have a better place to put this, read and populate related data. So imagine the customer number on the sales header. If you put that in just with assignment, that's all you get. If you validate it, there is really much data coming into the sales header and populated from all sorts, like from the customer, of course, from default dimensions, from all places, basically everything that relates to this. So that's also a good thing to do in validate triggers.
Yeah, because the validate trigger is our most specific trigger when trying to check whether a value has changed on a field.
Right. Exactly. Then also, like you could do. Let's first look at the voids. Create, delete, modify records. I know there are modifiers, and I know there are also creates in the base app. Especially when you look, I think the most prominent example for this is the dimension set entry. And we're going to touch this later again. But in general, starting write transactions when the caller of the validate code does not know about this, it's somewhere hidden underneath, and it couldn't be like a few levels deep under the validate, might not be a good idea. So that might be a better place, like to put it in the modify trigger or somewhere else where the caller knows that he's going to end up in a write transaction. And then also call web services. I mean, in general, if you only read data, like the VAT registration number, for example, on the vendor card, on the vendor record, it needs to call out to web service to validate the data correctly, and that's something you can do, but really do not call out write in other people's databases. So that's why we put the web services on here as well.
So this is what we're talking about for the rest of the presentation. So we're talking about proper validate code, or as we call it, a maintain code. There's always this legacy code with a lot of stuff inside of these validate triggers, and there might be exceptions for this where you can't just validate those fields, right? So we're talking about maintain code.
Yes, that's important. Okay, now, why do we want now always call validate? First of all, we always want valid data. If the data we have in our fields in the database is not valid and we cannot rely on that it is valid, then what should we do with the data? And the thing is, you don't know the definition of valid for a given field in the current, like nowadays. Because you don't know what extensions will end up in a database. The customer could go ahead and just install new extensions. Well, they should test this, they should talk about this, but they don't always do. And also Microsoft installs new extensions from time to time without us noticing. So the definition of valid for any given field could change any point in time. So you cannot rely on that you know that the data is valid just because you think you know it. And then when you do not call the validate trigger, that might break other extensions because they might rely on that their validation code that they hooked onto with the table extension or by an event is called to validate the data their way and maybe add extra validation. And we're going to see examples for this later. So that extension might stop working just because you insert records in a base app table without validation. And that's especially valid for app source apps because once, if you push out an extension to app source and it really, goes viral or just gets installed a lot, those are like, it will end up in environments with all sorts of configurations, different extensions installed, and yeah, you never know the definition of valid for a given field. And that certainly changed when we went from NAV to Business Central, to AL, from CL to AL, because back in the days when you had your NAV database, you knew what code was in there, and there was no way that there was code added without you noticing, because you needed to merge it into the database. So if somebody added a validation code, if some module, so to speak, if you added that to the database, you touched all the code manually, hopefully. So you knew about added validation code, and then you at least had a chance to react on this and adjust your code if needed.
Right, and Stefan talked about a lot about valid data in this slide. What is also very important is that we subscribe to validate triggers not only to validate data, but also to react on field changes, and that would be skipped as well. Yep. So if you have any business logic related to these field changes, we want to have that executed as well, right?
Okay, now pages actually always do validate, fortunately, because imagine users could just decide to turn off validation. And I mean, with config packages, there is a way, and I'm not sure if I want to speak that out loud. If anyone doesn't know this, probably a good thing. But yeah, just imagine in the client, they could do something like this. Go to my settings, just turn off validation for now, and just let me enter the data, because I keep getting some weird errors, and I don't know what this is all about. Just push in the data, because I know it's right. I think this will be the reaction for everyone. Now, why should developers be able to do this? If at least I am very concerned about users doing this stuff. So yeah, and I mean, pages even have more additional validates code, up to 5 events more of validation code that's being executed. So there is even more validation on the pages. So we need to remember this for the next slides, for some of the next slides as well. Okay, now your concerns. As I said, we collected some responses from Twitter, and the order is not by accident. I put the one that fits us the most on the front. It should be the default behavior to always validate, but you cannot do it always. Now, that not always should really be the exception. I don't know if I don't want to name a percentage probably, but like really, if nothing else works, then there is the exception. But what does not always actually mean? Now, the concerns to start with, what if performance is bad? I think this was the biggest one, and therefore also the first one we wanted to talk about. Many of you and other people out there, other developers, seem to be worried about bad performance with calling validate triggers. Now, this was the first thing we had in mind, speed versus accuracy. And there was that popular meme, I think, if you don't know it, take a time to read it. But the example I wanted to give here was basically, if you imagine video compression, if you have an uncompressed recorded video in whatever higher resolution, it's a really big thing, a big file you get. And you can reduce that by compressing the video with minor loss of quality, but that does not invalidate the video. You do not end up with a video you cannot understand anymore, you cannot watch anymore, at least depending on the compression, but you can really reduce the file size. Minor differences in ledgers, I don't know. I mean, if you increase the performance of the whole application, but you sometimes have a few cents of difference in the ledgers, and you can't explain why anymore, because, but it's faster. So, not sure if that's the same case. So now, when you skip validate triggers to make the application faster, do you also do something like this? And it's an abstract example, but I think I saw something similar some point in time in actual customer code, where some checks in the sales post were turned off because there were some errors. But it also increases performance a lot potentially, and also fix some errors. So I don't know. But now, what do you do if performance actually is bad, and you don't want to skip the validation code? Well, if this is actually an issue or a bug, then you can report that either to Microsoft, if it's a Microsoft code that's slow, or there are third-party apps, but you can also open a ticket, report that, and chances are that it might not have been discovered before. Like maybe your situation in your extension is, or at your customer is different. Maybe they don't know about this and they're happy if you report this. And like every other performance problem or any problem in general, you should report that to anyone who owns the code, so they can get better and they can work on it.
It's like every other performance issue. For example, if you I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, why should I call then a bunch of empty validate triggers if I know they don't do anything? Assignment is much faster to type, and as I am, probably many of you are used to type the assignment just out of muscle memory, and then refactoring that back to validate triggers can be tedious. And all those events that are raised, we saw there are 4 events, and then there has to be some overhead, right?
Right. Let's take a look. So what I've got here is, it's probably large enough. I've created or prepared a few tests for that. 3 tests each, one for an empty validate and one for validating the quantity on the sales line. So if I run these, it shouldn't take but a few seconds.
Maybe increase the size 1 point. Yeah.
All right, there we go.
And I think we can run it one more time, because 150 milliseconds is actually on the better, like the worse side of things.
There we go.
That's
so
better.
30 milliseconds for one validate, up to 7 seconds for 100,000 validates. And for empty validate, that's 7 milliseconds, which is still kind of large because it's 3 milliseconds larger than 1,000 empty validates. And as you can see, most of that is actually the overhead of the AL test tool. And when we could take a look at the code actually, so the only thing we do here is call a validate on the quantity with a static value.
And just to emphasize this is a quantity validation on the sales line. There is nothing turned off or anything. There might be code paths that are not hit because of the scenario, but this is not an empty validate.
Right, so there's a lot of code you probably have to scroll to find it all, and there are procedure calls and everything in that. And here we have an empty validate on a table I created. So there's really no overhead for that. And as you can see, maybe I run this test isolated. Oh, it doesn't change anything. But 7 milliseconds is on a real scenario when you are validating fields on a page for a user. They probably won't notice 7 milliseconds, even if you validate 10 fields. 70 milliseconds is still not enough for a user to see a difference. And if you look at the second test, even 1,000 validates for 4 milliseconds, there's arguably no difference for the user when considering empty validates or just assigning a value. Even if there is no apparent code in that validate trigger, there might be some event subscribers that rely on that field being validated.
Yeah, and so the overhead of an empty validate is probably not really noticeable. then there could be a scenario where the code is slow and it's a problem. It turns out as a problem and it is an issue, like there is something wrong with the code, therefore it's slow. But what if it's just, there is nothing wrong, there is not much to be improved, but it's still slow, then it's probably just doing much, and that probably has a reason to be there. So.
Right, so this performance here for an empty validate of one field isn't even measurable, really.
Okay. Let's get to the next topic. Chained or nested validate. So whenever you find yourself calling a validate, which calls a validate on another field, which calls another validate on another field, and you set loose this kind of chain reaction of validates onto that table, and it's really hard to control or foresee the outcome of that. There is probably a good reason why it is done that way. So again, when bad code is involved, that's a different story. But if everything is okay, then there is a reason that it was designed that way. So there is also probably a way to validate everything correctly so it works. So sometimes it's important to validate the field in the correct order and not just calling them in the order of how they are added to the by field ID or something, like just from top to down. And that might get complicated if you have a complicated scenario on a table and you need to find out the correct way of validating and filling all of those fields. And if that's your own extension, it might be a good idea to add a function to this, to the table, to simplify this. Just the number of parameters, and then the function will just do it in the way it has to be. And that if your code isn't closed, will also help other developers to read that code and find out, okay, well, this is how it has to be. Otherwise, on pages, the fields are probably in the order the user has to enter them, because we learned on pages, skipping validate is not an option. So there has to be a way to do this correctly.
So we've also got a demo for that. Here we have a simple example of a unit price including VAT, a line amount and a discount. And a chained validate in this case helps us keep the data coherent, right? So if we validate the unit price, we also update the unit price including VAT. In this case, there isn't even any VAT added to that, but that's... and we also update the line amount. And the line amount has some calculation in here considering the discount. So if you have these 4 fields, you really only need to validate the unit price in this construct and the discount. But everyone using the table doesn't necessarily know that. So the way I solved this was to create a function. So this function gets a amount and a discount and validates these 2 fields in the correct order. I have added the 2 other fields, unit price including VAT, and the line amount here as well, but they don't need to be validated because they are validated in the onValidate triggers of the unit price. So this is an example on what nested validates are for, what their purpose could look like, and how to solve the issue of the order of validation.
Okay. Now, what if I don't know what code will get executed, and I'm not sure how that actually, what happens, and maybe as I explained before, the extension adding more code, and I'm just not sure if the customer even needs that, all of that happening, and I'm just concerned that I just don't know. That's exactly why we're here. You don't know that, and therefore you need to execute it because you can't control all those extensions adding more code, more validation to this. And there is just, this is much about testing, and I mean, you can do automated testing, you can do manually testing, but you need to test. And the only way you find out if all of that is working, actually, if you populate the records with your code correctly, is to test it. And you need to test with all the extensions installed, because all of them could add stuff on after validate, on before validate, and you need to account for all of this. Now, when it comes to app source, it's really hard to test your app source code with all possible extensions installed. So that might be a challenge there. But still, you need to do that. And that's especially the case for customer environments. If you check all the extensions today, there might be new updates coming, new extensions being installed tomorrow, and they might introduce new validation code. So you really need to retest all of that before it gets installed again. And yes, that might break stuff, but it's not your responsibility to test other extensions of validation code. It's just your responsibility to test your code. So if you don't validate, that also might break stuff. And that then actually is your business, because you broke the other extensions by not calling the validates.
Right. And also, maybe you want to switch the perspectives a little bit. You've added some validate code, whatever it might be, some business logic, some other fields that need to be populated. You want to add an event subscriber to fill your own fields. That is also a possible scenario. And then you install an app from the app source, and they just assign those fields without calling a validate. Then your logic might get skipped, and you need to compensate for that. Maybe you need to create an event subscriber after modify, and then you struggling with, or is my field being updated, or is it any other field? And that leads to a whole bunch of other issues as well. So let's take a look at the demo.
Oh, there's another demo. Huh.
Got quite a few demos, but it's the same example as before, or the same table as before, but without any validate triggers. You've got the amount including VAT. Here it is a discounted amount and a discount. And as you can see, there are no validate triggers on here. And I've created a procedure, same as before, update amounts, which gets passed a new amount and a new discount. And I just lazily assign a new primary key, update the amount including VAT, the discounted amount and the discount. And there is no validate trigger, right? So there is no point in validating this, right? Well, actually, I have an event subscriber, but it's not on the table, but still in the same app. And this event subscriber, it's very simple. If the discount is above 50, I just get a message that the discount should probably not exceed 50%. This might be some type of typo or whatever, but this illustrates how even in the same app, at the first glance, you might not catch every validate trigger that's being executed, right? So you can also have table extensions on the same table in the same app, which can also contain validate code. And at this point, when you have a large app and or you want to add validate code to some field, and you are in the habit of assigning those values, it gets difficult, because if you want to create an event subscriber to that, and all your places where you assign or where you want to change those values gets assigned, it might be tough refactoring all of that and ensuring that it's still working, right? So, but if you validate from the first time on, you don't run into these issues. And there's no code in there that can break, because there's no code in there yet.
Okay.
All right, let's move on.
Let's see the next topic. So what if I know what will get executed, but I decided that I don't want to? I don't want to have that executed because it doesn't fit for my customer. It breaks my extension because I need to replace it somehow, or I don't know. There might be several reasons for this, and some of them might be like I don't see the value. It's therefore an unnecessary performance overhead if I just run this and it doesn't add anything, or I'm not using that part of the software, so I don't need that code executed at all. Well, the simple sentence for this is run it anyways. Like, it's not your decision to make. You can, if it's a whole module, you can uninstall everything or use everything like that. If the code owner didn't add a way for you to turn that a piece of code off, of functionality, then that might again be somewhat considered a bug. But if it's not, then it's probably there's probably a reason for this that it's executed. And then imagine somebody else would just come along and just decide that your code is not worth executing, or a performance overhead or something. So yeah, and it's really hard to foresee what consequences this might have, especially down the road. A few months later, you end up with data that's not like unexpected for that extension, and that might break stuff. And just to give an example again, the customer number, just imagine if you just assign this to the sales header, then I think you won't be able to post this unless you really know what else to add. And you might miss something that Microsoft added not too long ago you weren't aware of, that they added to in that validation trigger. So I think this is a good example where everyone agrees that this validation trigger has to be executed because there is a lot of code. And then the other one is the code does not function correctly, and that's again, congratulations, a bug. Yeah, this might be an exception that you actually find those kind of bugs. But if possible, again, try to report it. And if you need to have it working directly, you can try to implement a working solution and validate that yourself somehow. If there is no way to skip the individual code, you might need to skip the validate trigger in that specific example, but you really should report that. You should put the to-do in your code that you don't miss that place, and eventually it will get fixed. By Microsoft, it's probably 6 months into the future if it's not too critical. Otherwise, they will deploy a hotfix and you can move on pretty quickly, and then afterwards you can revert to the normal validation if the fix is in place. That was what we could think about whether you wouldn't want to execute code. Then infinite loops. I think everyone had an example or touched an example where you would validate a field, that would validate another field, which would validate the first field again, and then you're stuck in that kind of validation loop. And those are typically those kind of interdependencies, and you really need to assign values to both of those fields. But multiple, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, there are different kind of issues, like different kind of scenarios which raise different kind of issues. For example, the start date, end date kind of thing, where you want to make sure that the start date is not after the end date, but you cannot publish the start date first because then it will raise an error because the end date is still there, and then will be before the those kind of scenarios. There you might be. It might help to just assign both fields with a colon equal, and then afterwards call the validate on the field without assigning a new value that will then validate both of the new values at once, basically, like after another, but without assigning or changing those.
This example
values.
might be somewhat weird, but we've got a demo for that to really visualize how this might work, or what the issue actually is.
Yeah. So I mean, we can switch to the demo.
All right, let's take a look. We've got two examples. The first example might be the obvious infinite loop where I have a amount including VAT, and they update each other, right? So if I update the amount including VAT will be updated, in this case with a static 7%. And when I validate the amount including VAT, the amount gets validated with that 7% shoved off. So what I did here is calculate beforehand if the amount including VAT is the amount multiplied by 1.07. Right, so this way I can check beforehand, before validating the field, if that field is already updated or not. And the same goes for the amount including VAT. So in this case, I just calculate what I wanted the amount to be updated to, and can just check if there is any update required. And we can take a look at this in the web client. So if I enter an amount of 100, the amount including VAT gets set to 107. And if I update the amount including VAT to 100, the amount gets calculated to a somewhat odd number. All right, so the second example with the start and ending date, we've got the start date and the end date, and both of them validate the start and end date to a point where the end date must be prior to the start date. And when I update both values, I've created a procedure for that as well, where the start date gets updated and then the end date, and afterwards a validate is called without assigning a new value. So these validate triggers are executed, and, well, in this case, no table relation, but that would be checked as well, without causing any issues regarding which field is being updated first. So I don't need to worry about that.
Right, so you need to be careful a little bit with the second example, because sometimes validation code also checks if the value was actually changed, and in that, if that's the case, then you cannot call them like this, because then in the validation code they would not recognize the change anymore, since the assignment was done before. So this is just a little heads up, but you already get the idea now what the session is about, that you really need to also look at the validation code you're writing so that it is always callable. Because many of those examples we now gave so far are just showing you how to write for different scenarios, how to write the validation code properly so it can be called in all scenarios. So if there are endless loops developed into an extension, you're trying to validate those fields and calling the validate triggers, and it doesn't work because they did not care about those interdependencies. Again, a bug. Oh, yeah, thank you. All right, so now what if I write data just to my own fields? Like I have a dependent extension, I want to write data to those fields. There is really no dependency, and if there is a dependency, then they didn't probably, this might be our own extension as well, so this is like an internal pretend extension kind of scope. And I'm pretty sure no one else, like outside of the company or outside of our control, can really access those fields. Then what about other developers? Like if you're more than like one office of developers and you cannot speak to everyone every day all the time, and you don't know what everyone else is doing on the extension, also depending, of course, on the size of the extension or the suite of extensions you might maintain. There might be other developers who don't necessarily know, and they need to work with your code as well. So this is also like an dependency. Others are using your code that are not always aware. Sure, they'll probably be able to read through your code, but then again, this is an overhead. They need to verify that everything's working like they would expect this to work, and and so on. And now if you do not care about your colleagues, maybe you care about your future self. I'm not sure who does know exactly what code they wrote 6 months ago. I don't. So if I don't call validate in my code, I will probably in the future be annoyed because of that, because I cannot use, like I cannot hook onto the validate or cannot put code into the validation code trigger because I just don't call it from somewhere else. And this is a typical example of code debt, where you, in 6 months, you will need to go back and check, either do some workaround where you use the onModify, and then what Christian explained before, find out if the field actually changed, if this is what I'm reacting to, and then find some other cryptic way to get the job done. Or you need to start refactoring your previous code that might introduce new bugs, and so on and so on. So maybe one day you or one of your colleagues will need to hook onto the onAfterValidate event or onValidate event itself, and that's why you still should call the validate, even if you just write to your own field and there is no code, there might be code added at some point in time. Temporary tables. I think this is what many of you were waiting for, and now we probably slowly approaching the exceptions kind of phase of the presentation. We have split this into 2 types. First, the dedicated temporary tables. So whenever you set the table type to temporary, you have an object in front of you, a record, a table object, which knows about the fact that it's used as a temporary table. It's designed to be temporary. It will never be used as a regular table. That means if there is any validation code on that table, that validation code is aware of the fact that it's run on a temporary table. Therefore, call it. It's meant to be called. It has this is correct. So that's the first thing, and I would say that it's the better part, like the better usage of temporary tables. The other one we call hijacked temporary tables. So these are tables, for example, a sales line, which are not meant to be used as a temporary table. I know there are many examples in the base app as well where this happens all the time because there was no other way. Like we got the table type temporary. I would need to look it up, but it wasn't too long ago. And up until then, we just had regular tables and we could use them as temporary tables. So there was not that distinction. That wasn't even possible. So I think as a good practice, it's a bad idea to hijack tables as temporary tables in general, because that code is most of the time not meant to be written to be executed in a temporary scope. And that's not only true for validate triggers, but also for all the other code, like anything else. There could be events all around the place and not know about the fact anymore that it is in a temporary scope. That for that reason we have the isTemporary variable on records. We can check that and then exit or something, do conditional stuff. But I'm honest with you, half of the time I probably forget that this is there and do not account for this in my code. So it's a tricky thing. And then when it comes to the validation trigger code, for those hijacked temporary tables, if you really need to do that, you need to use them as temporary tables, regular tables, then you should probably decide on a case-to-case basis if you really need to call the validate triggers. I would probably start off with not validating them and then adding them in slowly after time.
So I found a very innovative example of the use of hijacked temporary tables, the sales line. So I came across not too long ago, like that week before, someone used a temporary sales line record to calculate sales prices, where they just validate quantity, the item number, and extracted the resulting sales price out of that, which did not go too well, as you might imagine, but it's somewhat illustrates why you shouldn't hijack tables as temporary. And I've also got a demo for that. So I've created a temporary table. This might be an example how you should not do this. There are like 3 fields on that: global dimension 1 code, global dimension 2 code, and the dimension set ID. And when I validate the like one of the dimension codes, I want to get the dimension set ID back. So for that, I use the dimension management code unit with the procedure validate shortcut dimension value. This procedure gets the shortcut dimension code right here and the dimension set ID by reference. And this procedure validates or gets me the dimension set based on the dimension code I give it.
Which is base app code. I mean, you all probably recognize this. So.
Right. So when I do this, the dimension set ID gets updated. This is the field. And afterwards, I can just validate this field in order to call the validate triggers and check if any tabulations apply here. But the issue with that is, bear in mind this is a temporary table. This validate shortcut dimension values creates a new dimension set ID if it doesn't exist already.
In the dimension set entry table
Right, so I'm working here on the temporary table, and on a validate, if I validate one of these 2 fields, there might be a case where other records are created that I don't necessarily want to be created when working with temporary tables. This might be a somewhat easy example, but think about what happens when more critical records get created. For example, sales document when working with a hijacked temporary table. That might be an issue.
Yeah, so I mean, we all can live with dimension set entries sitting there. I think they might get reused later by other tables, but this was like to give a example. You know already, and you can imagine where this potentially could go. And also one other thing to mention here, we pass in the field dimension set ID by reference into that function. So it gets updated in that function, but that function does not know anymore about the fact that this is a field, so it cannot call the validate trigger. So you need to think about that as well. If you want to call the validate trigger always, make sure that you either pass in a variable and then afterwards assign it to the field with validate, or just like Christian did, pass in the field and then validate it afterwards as a standalone line.
So this scenario is still somewhat still present when working with tables in the base app, that some records are just created and you don't necessarily know that, because this validate shortcut dimension values function doesn't state that it's that a new record is being created.
Yeah.
So this is why we say you shouldn't validate on hijacked temporary tables.
Okay, at least you really need to know what you're doing. Now, data migration tables. This is those kind of tables where when you did data migrations or upgrades or anything in the past, I used them a lot. Those tables where you just store the data. In the old days, we might have even written the data by SQL into those tables, and then write code units to put them in the right places in the system. So they might also be filled by config packages for that matter, and they're just used to store data until they're transferred to their real destination. The tables might get deleted after you finished. You don't need to keep them in the system. They won't get extended anything. They're just there during the migration phase, and then afterwards they're just dumped. Yeah, you can call the validate. There is no code. You saw the overhead of 7 milliseconds. If your data migration is that fast that the validates will make it slow, just skip them. Really no need to to call them, but you still can to keep your code in a clean manner. If you validate everywhere and you do not validate there, that just breaks the optics. So you might then start think, or others in code review might start to question, well, why isn't he validating here, just out of automation? And so yeah, just depends on you, I think. And we put data transfer on here. I think we are talking about this later again. But data transfer, you need to be aware it doesn't validate. It actually doesn't call any triggers, but it's also limited to upgrade code. So yeah, just because this is an upgrade scenario, we wanted to put this in here. You might use those as well to move data around in the database, but without validation. Okay. Now the other part that goes along with this, what if I do not load the data into my migration table, as we called it, but load it directly into the destination tables? So that might be those kind of scenarios where you migrate from a previous system, you want to populate the base app just to go live with the customer. And I hear that many times. Well, I know that has been validated because it was NAV 2016 and we're just re-implementing, and I know the customer is like, this is all valid data because it's just one by one just transferring. Well, the system is a new one. If you're coming from NAV 2016, just to name a number, BC, what are we now, 24, the base app changed quite a bit. There might be new extensions installed that all might add new validation code, change existing validation code. They might validate the data just differently. So,
and I mean, frankly, if you have any customer that, or you probably know that, if you have a customer that says, yeah, our data is valid, and you import that, and there's just a very interesting scenarios or very interesting data in that you can really call valid data, and I mean that's just happening.
Yes, and I mean it's not only about validating data; it's also about populating other tables, just reacting on the assignment of that field. So there is a lot going on potentially, and without that code being in place, without it being called even during initial load, the resulting system might not be functional. And that might not be noticeable on the first glance again. You might notice that later on. So, yeah, in our opinion, you should really try to simulate the user interaction with the system and just automate it. So, calling all the validates, doing the proper way to fill the tables, and then just get everything else populated alongside as if a user would enter the data manually. So, you still might need to turn off the validation on some fields, and again, this is a case-to-case decision you need to make, but you should try to start off with validating the fields and then turning them off as you need them. If you're doing upgrades, there might be documentation on this kind of things, and then again, at the end, testing everything to make sure it works. And then you should end up with a proper initialization of the system. Test code. That's an easy one, actually. Do you want to test the validation code? If yes, call the validate trigger. If not, then don't. As easy as that. You might have been in the session of Waco before about testing, about unit tests. You want to test exactly 100% of the code you want to test and 0% of the code you don't want to test. So if you don't want to test the validation code, just don't call it from test code.
Yeah, and if you want to have mock data or need mock data, you only want to have like the fields assigned you really need, and don't want to create any adjacent records by validating any fields. That might not be the purpose of your mock data, and will slow down your tests. So that's something you need to keep in mind.
Okay. That was the list of concerns we collected. If you have other concerns, keep that for the Q&A. We might have some responses for those as well. And we put together a little conclusion for you. So the do's we came up with was a validation trigger should validate user input. It might read, calculate, populate data from fields from other tables into the same table to help the user on the pages, of course, because again, on pages validation code is executed. And also you can leverage the same thing from code if you're calling the validation trigger. Just make it easier to collect everything that's needed. If there are complicated scenarios where you really depend on the order of execution of the validation triggers, create helper functions for your future self, for your colleagues, for other people leveraging your extension, having dependency on your extension. And if there is any scenario where you would have conditional code, like where you would say, well, I could imagine that this chunk of code might not be always needed, either put in control possibilities on setup pages, where you can just switch it off that way, or at event subscribers, event publishers, others can subscribe to with handle pattern, use interfaces, whatever. Just add control possibilities for those for others to turn off the optional code actually, because only that way they can actually still call the validate trigger, but disable your code individually. Otherwise, there is no option left, and they're just not calling the validation code, which then also might skip a number of other places and other code as well, alongside with this. Now the don'ts. That is a longer list. Database operations of any kind that are not reading. So you don't want to put the session that is calling your validate triggers into a write transaction without them noticing. And especially when you write data to different kind of tables in your environment, when coming from temp tables, that might really cause issues because those will get left over in the database and then might result in unwanted outcomes. Testability. Again, referring to the session, database access is really slow. You want your unit tests to be blazing fast, and database is the slowest thing you can do, like as an individual command in your tests. So when you force the code into the right transaction, if you force access to the database from your validate trigger, that can make testing quite a bit harder. And again, as I said before, the caller might end up in a write transaction without noticing this, and then you get those funny errors where you cannot run code units anymore in a condition, you cannot run pages in a condition, those write transaction errors. I'm sure everyone has seen those. And then also this might force order of validation of the fields. In an optimal or an ideal world, the validation code would be only concerned about the own field, like to validate the data that has been put into the field. So,
right, and also with write transactions in these modifiers, in these validate triggers, someone wants, you shouldn't call any invocation of any UI. But if that happens, if someone decides, well, I need this page to be run modal, or I want to run this code unit, I've lost my train of thought.
Invocation of UI is same thing.
Right, this will result in sooner or later in someone using commits, and that will result in a whole bunch of other problems. Then you suddenly have like one commit, multiple commits inside of this code because it's somewhere or some validation trigger calls like or sets you into write transactions, and another extension depends on this transaction being a read transaction in order to call a page. This can get messy.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think we skipped that one, the other people's databases. aka web services, then again, you end up like writing records somewhere where it cannot get rolled back if an error occurs, so that might run into issues. And then, we put a screenshot in here. I'm not sure if anyone ever did this, like on the rec dot do a change company. I wouldn't even imagine what happens. So we just thought it was a funny thing.
Inside of a validate trigger, of course.
Yes, I mean, and then also all the other rec functions we listed there. If you just do an insert in a validate like this, if the caller doesn't know about this, not all the primary keys might be filled, and then this runs against the wall and modifies for the same thing. If you do not want to call the modify until everything's filled, then the validate triggers call the modifies in between. It doesn't make really much sense. And then also like jumping to other records. Just don't do that stuff.
This is especially an issue when we're talking about pages, when a user is on a page and calls a validate, and inside of that validate trigger, there's a find set, find, or find first, and then jumps to another record. That might lead to a lot of support tickets.
Mm-hmm. And then this was, I think, a last-minute change, current field number in XREC. I think we saw an XREC comparison in the keynote today. So XREC is a thing, and this could be a whole session on its own, but it doesn't really work well with being called from code. It does work well, same as the current field number, when executed from pages. So then you don't notice any issues, but called from code, it actually leads to some weird behaviors. So you really want to be careful with this and really test this before you put this into any kind of code. Yeah. Then now there are a few exceptions, and again, just collecting what we already talked about. So test code, you do not really want to call validation code unless you explicitly want to test the code in the validation trigger. For hijack temporary tables, you need to really decide and check whether the code works in a temporary scope, and that might need to get retested if the extension base changes, so if any updates get installed or anything, because again, the code could change.
Yeah, and you really should consider whether or not you really need a hijack temporary table, or if a new temporary table, one you create on your own, suffices in this scenario. Because when you have a dedicated temporary table for this, you have all the control over how you want to use it, how or what validate triggers are, or validate events are on this one.
Yep. And then the last one, of course, if the code is buggy and it just doesn't work, you cannot execute it, and that's a no-brainer, but you really should think about raising this, reporting this, and then coming back to your code if it's fixed and update it to get back on the good side of things, on the bright side. Now, I think we have enough of time to cover those edge topics, like the additional topics, and the pages actually also have an on-validate trigger. And the question is, when should I put the code now on, like if I write my own extension, when should I put code on the page validation trigger in opposite to the record? And one good example was, if you do calc fields, you could do calc fields in the on-validation trigger if a flow field depends on that field. So then when the user enters the data, the flow field gets updated immediately and the user sees direct response. And that would actually be bad code on the table, because you do not want to calc fields, random flow fields that are maybe not even needed while writing a record. So that's typical page code to improve the user's experience, and that's not needed for code-only execution. Then any kind of UI, UX logic, style expression, hiding or showing fields dynamically, putting actions somewhere, like all those kind of things where you want to modify something on the page, like the state or anything else. That's typical stuff to do on the page. And then the last thing, if you use variables as a source expression for a field on a page. You have no option. If you need to validate the user's input, you need to do that on the page or just like somewhere else on the page. But I think the validation code is the best place to be there. There is no way to put that on the table. So, anything else I missed for the pages?
I think not.
I think that was it. Now, we found something interesting while playing around with this, and that's actually the onLookup trigger on the pages, because that really is related to the validation on the page itself. So it's pretty interesting because the validation happens automatically, and you can write the lookup trigger on pages in a way where it behaves as if the user had entered the data directly into the field. But you need to know that if the table and the page both define the lookup trigger, the page wins. I'm not sure if that's intended or why it is that way, but that's what we found out. So whenever you put onLookup code on the page, the lookup code on the table won't get executed. And on the table, it just works as you would expect. There is the trigger, you put code in there, it gets executed when you click on the ellipsis. And I think we can demo that as well, right?
Yeah, we can. So let's take a look into VS Code. I have a page with a simple field on that. This is the table for that. So I've got a primary field and a text field. And whenever I validate anything into this field, a message pops up, which shows me like the table unvalidate message with value, and then I've got the value here. And I've got this page for that. This is like only this one field is added onto this page, and whenever I click on the onLookup, the page gets, or the text that was entered into that field gets passed via this parameter, and I just add a page onLookup to that, so we can actually see how this affects the user input. So if I go here and type into that like a 10, I get a message.
Readable? Okay.
Should be large enough. I get a message table on validate message with value 10. All right, so the expected behavior, I enter a value into that field, and the validate trigger shows me what this value is. So when I click on this ellipsis, according to the code, I should get the page onLookup added to that. And as you can see, there's no other code in here. So in order for me to get that message, I need to have that field validated. So let's try it.
I think there is an exit missing, actually.
Might be the wrong page.
Okay.
Let me republish that.
Try exit true in the onLookup trigger.
Yeah, that's probably it. Right.
There you go.
Simple as that. So I get the page onLookup added to my value, and as you can see, this value gets added to the field, and this only works, apparently, when you add a exit true for that. So if you do an exit false, no value gets updated.
Yeah, and again, the reason why we included this was because it really interacts with the validation. I didn't know that before we prepared our session, so maybe somebody else still learned something from this as well. So, and now probably our largest slides. Transfer fields modify all, and we already touched the data transfer briefly. all of those do not execute any validates. The transfer fields is mostly used for transferring to posted tables. And you might argue, well, you typically have any validation code on posted tables, but I still think that it might still be a reasonable place to put in extra validation code or reacting on a field change to do extra stuff. There might be places in the posting routines to add that code, I know, but in my opinion, transfer fields is not really a thing you can use because validation code is skipped. And if you really just do not do the typical examples from the base app and just use the transfer fields because, well, somehow the fields map to each other, then you might break other people's extensions depending on that, or your colleagues. Now the modify all is the same thing, and I know I might upset some people if I say you shouldn't use modify all at all. Exactly that reaction. But again, it doesn't do the validation. So if you do modify all, you need to be aware of that any validation on that field is skipped. If there is code, it won't get executed. If there are any modify triggers on modify code, it's already only the less code version, because under the hood it's still doing the loopy loop version to run the modify triggers. So what I would really hope for if we could get a third parameter to say, well, if there is validation code, run that please as well. If there is no, and the runtime should be aware of the fact if there is validation code or not. If there is no code, then of course do the SQL batch operation, make it fast. But yeah, we don't have that parameter, at least not yet. I don't know if it's coming. I think there is an idea, so it might get voted enough, so we can get that. But again, if in favor of calling the validation trigger, you cannot really use the modify all. It's sad but true. So, and then the data transfer is the same thing, but it's very limited because you can only use it in upgrade code. It does not call any triggers, but that's part of the definition of that command, because it's used really to do batch shuffling of data from one table to a different table. So there we would expect that. But again, for the modify all, it's not documented, it's somewhat hidden that it's not doing that. Pretty sad, actually. Okay. One last slide. Start refactoring now. It's actually not that hard. There is a code action for that. You can just, if you use the AL Code Actions extension by David Feldhoff, you can just select whatever assignments you have and refactor them into validates, and yeah, get rid of those assignments. Okay, that's what we had prepared. Now we are open for any questions you might have, and let's see if we can answer them.
Right.
I think it was a very relevant presentation you did,
Okay.
very relevant subject. And actually, when I do code review, I always require that you explain if you are not using validate, because of all the things you've presented.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have this subject, what about, you said that the user can't pass by the validate in the pages. But what about the insert and the modify triggers? Have you thought about those too, that you would say exactly the same as with the validate?
Yes.
That you want the quality, you're talking about the quality of the data. So you want the validate to be run. But what about the triggers for insert and modify? Isn't that the same?
Short answer, yes. Same story. In our opinion, those triggers should not be skipped either. And there are more ways where we can actually execute it, but at least for the onModify, I'm not sure about the onInsert actually, but the onModify, there is a way to subscribe to them even if they are not executed. Like if the parameter is false, there's still an event that's raised. So there is at least a way you can ensure your code is executed. That's not the case for the onValidates. So that's why our focus was on the onValidate for this session. But you're absolutely right. Yes, those should be executed as well. And I mean, you can even argue that the order of execution should always mimic the order the user needs to do. So you first do the init, then you do primary keys, you validate the primary keys, of course, then you do the insert trigger, then you do the rest, and then you do the modify, because that's exactly what happens if the user enters data through the page.
Right. So if you mimic the user's behavior, you probably can get wrong data or invalid data.
If it works on the page, I mean, it has to work in code as well. If you do the exact same thing, there shouldn't be a difference.
Yeah.
Right.
Any other? There we go.
If you're importing data from external systems, sometimes you just can't do a validate because these data may not correspond to your system, but it's just the way it is. If the external system is the leading system and BC is just an external system which is used for things the other system cannot do, you have to take the data as it is. And if you start validating it against your other master data, which you've taken from the external system at an earlier stage, sometimes it doesn't work. So you cannot validate. You have to live with incomplete data. And
yeah, well, if that's a scenario where what is like in the acceptable range of your solution, if you know the data cannot be valid, and you have designated fields for that or whatever, where you put the data in and you know it's like it doesn't correspond with the rest, I mean, it should be documented somewhere for anyone else not familiar with this to read upon it and not stumble across it, but yes, agree. Luke, had a question?
I second fully that it's a great overview. Thanks for the effort. Okay, thank you. I think there's one thing where we might differ in the look. You say about the user perspective, user input validation, but I don't think code is always the same. In the code, we not always need to mimic what the users are doing, and that might differ. And you might know, I shared my blog post. I think in some instances you first want to assign and only validate one because it's going to call the chain. And that one is more effective than doing every field on its own. So I think it's not always the same, but that's something to discuss.
The problem is, in our opinion, the problem is with this that you don't know who else might subscribe to the fields you skip.
No, but in the end, in that chain, it will be an nested validate on all the fields anyway, so they will be picked. Yeah? So, like the example I gave on the general ledger, general journal fill-in, you only need to fill in assign a number of fields and call one of the validates, and it will call everything else. So, in that case, I think you need to study the code and make it more efficient.
I mean, we can continue this discussion for long.
I know. Yeah, just want to mention.
Okay.
Hi. Could you please elaborate a bit on, excuse me, there was a quite huge statement, no validates in test code whatsoever.
Yes.
That's at least how I understood it. Could you please elaborate, what does this mean? Are you afraid that by doing onValidate you would find out something else before you come to the point that you are actually testing? Or more in a sense, you're talking about mocking some data or preparing some data for testing later. In which sense? And
both. I mean, first you need to prepare the database. Maybe you need to write records. You need to have something you can test with.
But
and
you
in
could
that case,
validate as well, or
no, because you want to control 100% of what data you're inserting. You're inserting it in a way with assignments where to have the result how you need it, And if you do validates, the code might change. You might run into, like, depending on the extensions and what code might change that is subscribing to the validates, and that makes your tests unpredictable. So when you're mocking data, if you somehow can just assign them to make to have a reproducible test case, and then if you then need to test one validate, if that's the given when then the when part, then you can call the validation because that's the code you want to test, and then you can execute it. But if you're just preparing the database to run your test against that data, you typically don't want to validate because you cannot 100% be sure that that code will always be the same and not modify your givens under the hood.
All right, thanks.
So I think here was another question somewhere.
Somewhere in the middle. Can you pass that along?
Yes. Are you planning to add a check for this in the linter code?
I thought about this, yes. I haven't gotten to it, but it's certainly an idea, yes, to just have maybe a disabled rule, because not everyone might get warnings on all the assignments and all the code. But yes, you can activate it, and then you get just reminders on where there are still assignment in your code. I need to think about this because there might be exceptions, and I do not really like pragmas. So that might also be another scenario where you could just put in a code comment and then the warning goes away or something to explain the assignment. But yeah, I thought about that already. That's an idea.
Okay.
You can throw maybe. Thank you. So, can I throw? Oh, slow again. Okay, short.
Okay, so about about infinite loops. Your solution was I check if a value is already on the other side. But what if the two values are numbers, decimals, and calculations may lead to like the third decimal to be different? How would you handle such a case? Because the condition would not. I cannot talk in English, but I think I got the point. Yeah.
That might. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around just by description, but I think that might also be an example where you want to fall back to a different function, handling the exact steps, how you need to do that, how you need to run the validation code so it works. But yeah, that's certainly a case where you need to think, like, have a look at your example, and then get creative to enable others to validate the field still, to catch that. And if there is no way around, if it's not possible to always call the validate directly on the fields, then again, probably something you need to document and say, well, use this function, and then everything gets validated or executed correctly.
Okay.
In the worst case scenario, you could always create a global variable on the record, which you can set to true or false, depending on whether or not you have updated this field already.
Mm-hmm.
So this way you can break out of infinite loops all the time.
Yeah,
basically.
I'm gonna say something that will make somebody angry, but I'm thinking about some code at my previous company. I didn't wrote it. I just had to maintain it. They actually had a single instance to check whether everything was already in place.
The same idea.
The same idea. If you need the scope in global somewhere, then yeah, you need to do a single instance. Just need to be careful to control the state, and just afterwards you can pick up the shit.
Yes, thank you. I want to add a don't from my practical view, because when you use change company, and after that, you do a validate. That's not a good idea, because
That's right.
from this situation, you don't have in the validate, if you use other tables, then the change company is not used.
The change company only works for the record you're calling it on, and anything else that's run in the code, that will still run in the original company scope. So yeah, that's right. Absolutely correct. Okay, some more questions. There we go.
Thank you. So I have this scenario where you have 5 different applications, for example, extending one base application, right? And you validate one field from this base application in all the applications. I mean, which application wins in case of, well, because they validate with different values, which one is a winner and how to deal with that?
I think this is the old topic of event subscribers in the order of execution for event subscribers in general. And I think there is an unofficial answer to that question, which I won't tell you now, because the official one is you don't know. The code needs to be written in a way where the order doesn't matter. So validation will run in whatever order that you might hit. And then if one throws an error or something, everything will stop at that point. Or if you put populate other fields, then that should also work no matter what order it get executed. Otherwise, you will need to put like some other construct in there to control the order yourself.
So basically, there's nothing you can do about it.
No, the order of execution, you cannot control that.
Thank you.
Some more questions? There's still, okay. We still have 3 minutes.
It's a good idea to have a validation on the fields, but maybe it's also a good idea to start talking about validatability of the code. I mean, you cannot insert whatever you want in a validate trigger.
Yeah, and
okay.
we tried to cover this a little bit.
Are there some principles or some documentation about that, some methodology? I don't know.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, everything we thought was important, we put into the slides to really, like, if you write validation code, care about the value you're working with, like that was put into your field, make sure that this is valid if you need to check that, or populate other fields based on that value. And everything beyond that basically is really something you wouldn't want to have in the validation code for various reasons, write transactions, stuff like that. Okay. But I don't think there is any official documentation on what is like good in a validation trigger and whatnot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. That's not a question.
When you do the posting schema from the sales line to the item ledger entries, you go through item journal. You don't validate the fields then.
Why?
That's the rule.
Why? Well, the well, then I would call those validation triggers being wrong. Controversial topic. So our idea is that if you should be able to react on any field validation of all the fields, because you might need to put your custom logic, which the extension author cannot foresee. You need to be able to attach that to the field validation, and we did. I mean, we can talk about in detail about this, but I couldn't think of any cases where you couldn't write the validation code in a way where you would enable the callers to always validate this, given exceptions. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much for joining.